I'm Ben Ryman, and this is Behavior Speak. In this conversation, Dr. Haley Shea, a citizen of the Myaamia Tribe of Oklahoma, discusses her work at the Myaamia Center, focusing on cultural and language revitalization efforts. She shares insights into the history of the Myaamia people, the significance of the Heritage of Word program at Miami University, and the impact of language on community well-being. The conversation highlights the importance of community engagement, assessment, and evaluation in fostering cultural identity and growth within the Myaamia Tribe. Welcome, Haley.
Thank you.
Before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge I'm producing this podcast from the territories of the Klabin, Clayhus, Homoko, and First Nations. Grateful to be here. So yeah, Haley, tell me about yourself.
So I am a citizen of the Myaamia Tribe of Oklahoma. I currently work as, I actually have 3 jobs, which is interesting, but I work half-time at the Myaamia Center at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. I am the director of the Office of Assessment and Evaluation. And so our team examines the impact of language and cultural revitalization on various outcomes, but largely just general well-being within our community. And then I have a private practice. I'm a licensed psychologist in the state of Ohio. So I have a private practice where currently I'm doing all telehealth. And I also work for a small fitness company creating mental health content for their platform. So yeah, I have my hand in lots of different areas, which I love.
Really cool.
Yeah.
So before we kind of dive into all your work, for someone who's completely removed from a lot of this stuff, the only reference I've ever had in my entire life to Miami is this place in Florida that everyone talks about. And up until I started reading about you, I just assumed you were in Florida, and I'm sure probably maybe a lot of folks who don't have a clue think that. What's the connection there?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that Miami of Ohio likes to tout is that Miami was a university before Florida was a state. So, you know, the connection between Miami of Ohio and Miami, Florida is not very well known. There are speculations, but generally Miami University is in Ohio, which is in the traditional homelands of my tribe, right? So our tribe's traditional homelands or historic homelands were the entire states of Illinois and Indiana, basically like the western portion of Ohio, and then a sliver of Wisconsin and Michigan. So that is the lands in which we, you know, lived, hunted, sustained ourselves, essentially. And so Oxford, Ohio, which is where Miami is in that. So Miami University is named after the Miami River Valley, which is named after our people. So it's not directly that the university is named after the Miami tribe, but indirectly it is because the area was named that for us. And so that's really the connection between the tribe and the university.
Okay.
At least in terms of landscape. There's a much broader story in terms of like relationships, which I'm happy to dive into if you're interested.
Sure. But what about the word Miami? So the spelling is sort of different. What's going on there?
The word Myaamia.
So there's Myaamia, and then there's Miami as the city and the university and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, Myaamia is our word for ourselves, right? The word that we use in our language. Miami, I think, is just, you know, they're often
Americanized, whatever.
Exactly. Right. When I don't know who it is, the folks that name regions or cities,
right,
often take inspiration from Indigenous languages, but find that too hard, I think, to pronounce. And so they just make it, you know, an anglicized version of a word. So that's probably
gotcha.
the difference.
Okay, so who are the Myaamia people? Tell me a little bit about them.
Yeah, so I am one of them. I mean, the Myaamia people, we are, you know, a federally recognized tribe. Like I said, originally I outlined our traditional homelands. We were so for a little bit of history, we were living in that region alongside many other tribes, and were eventually removed by the United States federal government. We signed a series of treaties over hundreds of years that ceded more and more land. And that was, for us, our community's way of trying to survive. Was we have peacefully coexisted with many other nations for, as long as we can remember. And we think we can do the same with the United States government, with these settlers. And so that's what those treaties were, what we were doing in signing those treaties, was our attempt to be able to just peacefully coexist. But as we know from the history of colonization, that's what ended up happening. And, we signed more and more treaties until we held just a small portion of land in what is today Indiana. And again, signed a treaty that gave up that land, but we didn't actually think that we would have to leave, because we had tribal members who owned land, right? Like fee simple land, like we think of today. And we thought that everybody would be able to live on those lands, which ultimately did not happen. The United States sent in the army to enforce the terms of the treaty, and we were removed at gunpoint from Indiana, basically loaded onto some canals, and then, various boats down to Cincinnati, where we were put on another boat on the Ohio River, and taken over to a reservation in what is today known as Kansas. And that's where our first reservation was. And then about a generation later, about 20 years later, we were forcibly removed again from Kansas to Northeast Oklahoma, where our tribe is headquartered today. And so, if you think about like transitioning from lands east of the Mississippi to the west of the Mississippi was a very big transition. But then even having to do it again was yet another transition. So our people went through and experienced quite a bit of, obviously that's a massive trauma, just the entire process, but then, a lot of loss of our ability to practice our culture, because so much of that is tied to the landscape. And so having to adjust to that was a lot for our people. We lost people on that, that trail, on that journey, and then experienced significant cultural loss as well. And then, so after that removal process, right, came the United States government's next attempt at assimilation. And so many of the children in our community were required to go to boarding schools, which, I've listened to a few of your podcasts now. I know people have talked about that. So a lot of our youth went to those boarding schools historically, and that led to yet another significant decline in the practice of our language and culture, right? And so to the point where in the 1950s was when the last of our first speakers passed away, right? So we had no more first language speakers of our tribal language. And so our language became, a lot of people use the word extinct. That is not a word we like to use intentionally because we speak it today. And so we call it sleeping, right? So there were actually many missionaries, French and Jesuit missionaries, who came and documented our language and culture. And so because of that, we had significant written documentation of our language. And in the 1990s began a revitalization movement that was largely led by Daryl Baldwin, who is the executive director of the Myaamia Center, as well as David Costa, who is a linguist who studied our people and works at the Myaamia Center today. So he now lives in Ohio as well. And they basically built our language back up from this documentary record. And so that started in the 1990s. Daryl, made it his responsibility to teach his family. And so a couple of his kids spoke Myaamia before and during learning speaking English, which is great. And began, that community outreach portion of it as well in the 90s and early 2000s. And we've really seen a significant explosion right, of community engagement and community interest since that time. I personally attended the very first summer camp that our tribe put on in 2005. So I would have been 13 or 14 at that time. And I personally fell in love with it, right? This was something that felt like it was missing in my life, something that I had always been told was a part of my heritage. It was a part of my background, but I didn't know what that meant. And so coming to this camp felt like I finally had something to grasp onto. And, during this time, our tribal leadership began to notice a lot of positive changes, right? So people were coming to events again. I wasn't around at this time, but they talk about there being annual meetings, which is like our government meetings, government proceedings, where there were not enough people at times to even meet quorum to vote, or there were just barely enough, or like there were only 10 people there, right? And so like that was a really difficult time for our people. And over time, we now have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that come to these annual meetings. So we've continued to see a steady growth just in attendance, but also in engagement. And our tribal leadership started to ask questions like, what's going on? What is producing this change? And that's largely been attributed to this language and cultural revitalization, right? And the way we talk about it is that our reconnection with our knowledge system is what promotes these positive changes within the community. So, that's the overall message. So today we are, in a lot of ways still building up our resilience and still building up our knowledge system, but we're also thriving, right? Like we're living and practicing our culture every day, which is, an opportunity I'm really grateful to have.
Do you have a credential with the International Behavior Analysis Organization, the Qualified Applied Behavior Analysis Credentialing Board, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, or would like a certificate of attendance for another organization? You can earn continuing education units by going to www.behaviorspeak.com, clicking on CEUs, and entering the 3 secret words. The first secret word is language.
It's amazing. Wasn't just going back to the 50s when the last first speaker passed away, was the language not passed on sort of because of the boarding schools essentially taking all the kids away?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of contributing factors, right? And this is certainly not something I'm an expert in. There are other people in my community who would be, but part of it is just the literal death of tribal members who didn't pass it on to their families or didn't have family members to pass it on to. We also experienced a significant dispersion of our people, right? So we live in diaspora today. So, we have population hubs that reflect that removal route. We have population hub a group that stayed in Indiana. We have a group in Kansas. We have a group in Oklahoma. And then we also have people in 49 out of 50 states, as well as internationally, right? So we live throughout the entire world, but incredibly dispersed throughout the United States, right? And if you don't have people around to talk to, that makes it really hard to maintain that language. But then boarding schools played a significant role, right? So my family was one of the families that stayed in Indiana, actually, because I'm a direct descendant of one of the chiefs at the time of removal. And so, my grandmother's generation, my grandmother did not go to boarding school, but some of her siblings and cousins did. And they were very much taught that being Native was something to be hidden, was not necessarily something to be ashamed of, because the idea of pride was something I think that kept Myaamia people tied to that identity. So they were still prideful, but it was something you don't share. It was something that you don't teach, you don't talk about it. And so, it didn't really get passed down. My grandmother didn't learn much of the language, but I know that her grandmother only spoke Myaamia and a few other languages, but, didn't speak English very well. And so somewhere in that period is where it got lost. And then because of that, keeping it hush-hush, largely because of boarding schools, didn't get passed down to my dad's generation, right? Which means that he didn't know what to share with us, me and my siblings, until I went to camp. We didn't know a lot about it. But, now I work at the Myaamia Center. My sister works at the Myaamia Center. My brother teaches his kids. My dad works for the tribe. So it's like we are very much re-engaged with the community, again, largely because of that revitalization movement.
So what happened in the 90s? What was how did this all start? How did they start revitalizing?
I largely think that it is because of the personal interest of Daryl Baldwin and David Costa, right? So David Costa is this linguist from California. He needed a community to study. He specialized in Algonquian languages, which is one of the language family that our tribe comes from. And so he stumbled upon this opportunity where there's significant documentary record, but not a lot known, very few people who speak any of the language and no first speakers, right? So he's doing this project simultaneously, while Daryl is going to school to become a linguist, so he went, he's done a lot of things, but
Right.
he was in graduate school to become a linguist and having his first couple of kids in the 90s, well, late 80s and early 90s. And then I think just committed to, I'm going to learn this language. I'm going to teach my family and hopefully be able to give this back to the tribal community. And that just became his passion, which really just took off, right? So he and David worked together, like I said, to build a dictionary. So they started like a paper, like an actual physical copy of a dictionary. I probably have it somewhere back on my bookshelf. And, they taught their kids, and other people who were engaged at the time also were learning alongside Daryl and teaching their families. And so, once it's kind of like an ember that's burning, right? And like once that spark took off, it spread. And so that's continued to take off over time. So
tell me about this first camp that you went to. What did it entail?
Oh, I have fond memories of that. So it was a sleepaway camp at the time. We don't do sleepaway camps anymore. Those were exhausting. It took a lot of resources, but it was largely because they knew that people would be coming from all over and that, they would need housing, they would need places to stay, that it wasn't feasible for them to come and, just do a day camp. So my parents drove us out to Oklahoma. It's about a 10-hour drive from Indiana to Oklahoma. And dropped us off. I went with a couple of my cousins, and it was really, my memory is spotty. I have very bad memory of my childhood. So the things I do remember are there was a lot of lacrosse being played. There was a lot of language that was incorporated. I vividly remember them setting up a store, right? And so we were taught like certain object words, and then we were taught how to say different numbers and then currency terms, right? And so then we would have to ask, like, how much does this thing cost? And like, basically words for exchange, like, here you go, give me this, I have this much, right? So we would learn these terms that would allow us to engage in this like mock store. I remember the counselors, which this is a holdover, this is still true. So the counselors for this camp were students who attended Miami University, right? So these were Myaamia students who were studying at Miami University. And I just thought that was the coolest thing, right? And I know that's still something today that, it's a very excellent pipeline to get these, youth interested in learning their heritage language, and then a pipeline into college where they can then do something that ultimately often gives back to the tribal community. So it's a really great pipeline. But so they were our counselors. So these college students with kids ages 10 to 16. So it was, perfect for modeling, for role models to look up to and that kind of a thing. I remember there was some storytelling, though our storytelling at the time was not quite at the point in our revitalization process that it is today. So it was largely like written stories that they were reading from. Today we do tell stories pretty much orally, at least formally. There was, lots of hikes, exploring and learning about the landscape in Oklahoma, and just a lot of socialization time. So getting to know other people, and a couple of the people that I met at that camp, right, I'm still really close with to this day. And a lot of them, or a couple of them, work for the tribe or the Myaamia Center in some capacity as well today. And so I get to work alongside some of them, which is really awesome. I was roommates in college with one of them, right? So had a really great experience at those early camps.
Did you become a counselor yourself?
I did. So I went for a few years as a camper. My cousins came with me that first year, maybe the second year, but they didn't come back much after that. But I was still interested in going. So at the time we had a junior counselor process. So basically people who had shown interest and had, expressed that they were wanting to continue could come back as a junior counselor, right? So really like 16, 17-year-olds, they didn't quite trust you to be a counselor and fully responsible for someone's life yet, but like you could help in some capacity. So I came back as a junior counselor at the end of high school. And then as a counselor, I think the summer after my senior year of high school and all through college. So I was a counselor then. through college, and I attended Miami University. I mentioned that as a Heritage Award Program student. And then once I graduated from college, came back as a researcher. So now I do research on the camps.
Cool.
Ever since from graduate school on, I've been doing more of the research side. So I've been engaged with those camps almost every year since I started, which is pretty cool.
And what's the Heritage Award program?
Yeah, so that is it's a program that started the very first students who attended the very first Myaamia students that attended Miami University as part of this Heritage Award program was in 1991. And that was, it came from a relationship that started in the 1970s, right? So this is a long story to get to what the Heritage program is, but our chief at the time in 1972, his name was Chief Forrest Olds, spontaneously was making a trip to Cincinnati and had heard of this place called Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and that it was very close. And so he just showed up one day. And the story goes that he came to the president's office. The president wasn't there. And so other administrators took him around campus, took him to athletics. The mascot at the time was the R word of Miami University. And so, that was the start of a relationship. He came back 2 years later and actually was able to meet the president of the university, President Shriver. And that was really the start of the relationship between Miami University and the Myaamia Tribe of Oklahoma. Was just these two leaders, right? Like two people at the top of their institution at the time.
Wow.
And, over time just continued to build that. Chief Olds passed away a few years after that, but his successor, so the next chief, Floyd Leonard, he, made this his priority to continue this relationship because I think he saw the potential that having a partnership with a university could have for the tribe. And so, that led to the establishment of the Heritage Award program in the early 90s, and it's a scholarship. So basically, it's not really a true scholarship. It's a tuition waiver. So Myaamia students who get into Miami University of their own accord, right? So there's no pulling strings to get our students in. You have to still be admitted based on the typical admission process. They receive a tuition waiver. And between 1991 and 2003, there was nothing associated with it, right? They just came, they got this tuition waiver, and that's it. In 2003, they established basically some requirements that go along with it, which were that you now have a class that you attend. It's a 1 credit hour class for 3 years. And so there's basically a rotating series of courses. So one is ecological perspectives and history. One is contemporary issues and sovereignty. And then the third is a language course, right? And so you basically come in your first year at whatever year you find yourself in. So they just rotate. And everybody, so freshmen through juniors, are in that class together. And then it just rotates. And then your senior year, you do a senior project. And so that's the form that it took. In 2003, they started this more formalized program. And so that, I think, the big statistic that we like to share is, between 1991 and that 2003, our graduation rate for our students was about 56%, which is much higher than the national average for Native American students across the United States, but much lower than the general Miami University population, as well as the broader college graduation rate. And this is a 6-year graduation rate.
Right.
Since the establishment in 2003 of these courses, our graduation rate is now, today it's at 89.89%. It was up to pre-COVID, it was up to 92%. But obviously COVID took a toll on all college students, and our students being no different. So that did decrease our graduation rate just a little bit. But we know our students were coming, but being given nothing to connect them to each other. A lot of them didn't even know the other students, and they weren't given many resources or a lot of support. And a lot of them were coming from out of state. And so it was a really difficult transition for them. And the establishment of these courses gave students something to hold on to, right? Gave them a knowledge system, gave them connection to people, gave them connection to cultural practices. And that is largely what we attribute that intense jump in graduation rates to. So yeah,
and is
we
that
know
comparable to the rest of the university now?
it's actually higher.
Yeah.
Actually higher.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. I want to dive into some of the work you're doing. But before we do, I was curious, had Dr. Robin Midthorn on talking about sort of higher education and tribal colleges and things like that. This is different than a tribal college, right? So is there a hope for something like that, or a need for something like that? Or I don't know a lot about them, so.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm fully the person to speak to about this.
Yeah.
In fact, my sister probably would be. She's she's got a master's degree in student affairs and higher education, and she's the person that serves that role for us. Yeah, and I believe I listened to that episode, so I do know, what she was talking about a little bit. And we are not a tribal college. Tribal colleges are typically, serving predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly serving Indigenous communities, but tend to be more pan-Indian, if you will, right? So many communities can be served by that. Ours is a one-to-one university to tribe relationship, right? So it's just the Myaamia Tribe of Oklahoma as of right now that's served by this.
Right.
So it's a little bit different, which I also think is what allows us to be incredibly successful because, when you're in a pan-Indian space, and not that tribal colleges aren't successful, I'm not implying that at all, because they are, and they're incredible. But for us, we're able to focus all of our attention and resources on our community, right? So first and foremost, the Myaamia Center serves our tribal community. Funding predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly comes from the tribe. And we have a memorandum of understanding that anything that comes from the Myaamia Center is the intellectual property of the tribe, not of the university.
Nice.
Right, which is an inherent recognition of our sovereignty, which is incredible, right? Because I don't know of many institutions that would do that with an academic center that's bringing in grant money and that kind of a thing. And so what was the question?
You've answered the question. I don't think it was the right kind of question. And maybe your sister's the person to ask this question.
Yeah.
Because I think the sense I'm getting, and I hope to have more conversations like this so I can learn more about it, is that, tribal colleges aren't the only way to do this. And in fact, even Dr. Minthorn's work involves tribal colleges also partnering with these larger institutions to sort of make things happen. That sounds like what you folks have done, which isn't necessarily the right way or the better way, but it's definitely working really well for you, is you've created this center that's solely for your tribe, and all of the work you're doing and all the funding for it comes from and goes back to your tribe. And so in many ways it's meeting all your needs. And so it's not, you don't necessarily need a tribal college to sort of to develop those sorts of things. And your interesting point about tribal colleges often being sort of many different tribes kind of attending. I wasn't aware of that. And so that sort of, makes sense. Maybe someday there will be a tribal college, but it could just be for other reasons.
Sure.
In the area. How large is the Myaamia community at Myaamia Tribe?
Yeah, so that's another, one of the outcomes that my team looks at is the impact of language and cultural revitalization on national growth and continuance. And, in the 1990s, which is really like when we start looking at data, our tribal population was around 1,500 people.
Wow.
Today we're over 7,000.
Okay.
Right. We're not, I know you can't see right now, I am pregnant. It's not because we're having babies at higher rates, right? It's because people see a reason to enroll their kids in the tribe again, right? Like through language and cultural loss, people didn't have a reason to enroll their families in the tribe, right? Like to become a member of a federally recognized tribe. They didn't see any benefit to it. And through this language and cultural revitalization process, people have been, enrolling themselves and their family members at higher rates. And it's just continuing to grow exponentially. So today we have about 7,000 or a little over 7,000 tribal members. I don't know the exact number. because it changes on a monthly basis.
And that opens up, a can of worms of different questions, which we don't need to necessarily get into today, but, about sort of federally recognized tribes and that whole thing, and that it requires, you have to be recognized in order to be something. But
right.
I didn't even think, I wasn't even thinking about the answer being there's 7,000 folks that are enrolled. It kind of a two-part question, and you may not know the answer to both of these or either of these, but one is there any idea of sort of how large the tribe might have been sort of pre-colonization?
Yeah, I'm not the right person to speak to on that. That would be a historian.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. This is why our work at the Myaamia Center is so interesting to me, because we are highly interdisciplinary, right? Like, I know there are people who could answer that question at the center, and I could get it easily if I had time to email.
Sure.
But we don't all, right? So a lot of times other communities, like, there's one person who holds all the knowledge, right? And that person is really valuable. But then once, something happens to them, all of that gets lost, right? Our community very much takes this interdisciplinary approach. And so we hire people like myself, who's a psychologist, we have historians, we have linguists, we have education people, right? And no one of us holds everything so that we can, and then we, work together to create the best possible outcomes that we can. So I know that's not at all related to your question.
No, it answers it in the right way. And the answer may be the same to this next question. If you're up to 7,000 enrolled members, is there any concept of just how large the diaspora is, including folks that aren't enrolled? Like, how many more could be enrolled?
Yes. So, well, yes and no. I don't actually know any numbers. Right. I know it's significantly larger. So there is actually the Miami Nation of Indiana. I think it's actually the Miami Nation of Indians of India. I forget the actual name. They're a 501c3, and they are not federally recognized, right? They've applied a few times for federal recognition. It's my understanding, which could be inaccurate. Put that disclaimer out there, but it's my understanding that because there is a pathway for those individuals to be a part of a federally recognized tribe, that means that they are not going to likely become a federally recognized tribe in and of themselves, right? And so, that is predominantly folks who stayed in Indiana at the time of removal, and now there's this large population hub there. But through their roots in that traditional homeland, as well as, people have emotions and there's politics at play that kind of created a little bit of a split there. Yeah. There are people who don't want to become federally recognized, or members of the Myaamia Tribe of Oklahoma. They want to be federally recognized on their own as the Miami Nation of Indiana. And I believe they have a couple hundred folks who are regularly engaging. I don't know the actual numbers, but a couple hundred folks that are pretty regularly involved. And like I said, we know we have people throughout the entire country. We're regularly hearing of people who reach out to us who say, I've always been told I'm Miami, but I don't know much about it. And thankfully we have genealogists. So, yet another a group of people. We have people who specialize and study that, who can help them out with that if they're seriously interested, or just pass along whatever information they might need if it's more of just a curiosity.
Well, I think I just never, because I know so little about it, I never kind of made the connection that, because I've talked to folks from a lot of different tribes and nations now, and they've told me about sort of, we've got 400 people here and 10,000 people here, and we're the largest one in the country here, but we've got like 20,000 people here, which is, the size of just a small town. And I never sort of put together that there could be just many, many more folks from these different tribes that just aren't part of this federal piece.
Right.
And so it's a really difficult question for anyone to answer.
It is.
Yeah,
it is. I mean, it gets into all sorts of stuff, right? Like blood quantum and how we categorize Indigenous identity, and which is incredibly complicated and problematic. There's so many factors at play. At least for our tribe, I'm incredibly grateful because, so many members of our tribe, and this is a fairly unique perspective, but we tend to view our status as a tribe as a political group, not a racial group. right? So we have people who are of all races who are members of our tribal nation. And therefore, right, like so much of blood quantum is rooted in this idea of race, right? This social construction of race. So a lot of people in Indian country feel this, I don't have this appearance to be native enough, right? And that
Sure.
their identity is called into question because of that. And I very much had that as a child, right? That's where a lot of my feelings came from as a child. But our community is very adamant that like you are Miamia. If you are a member of our tribe, you are Miamia. And our constitution says basically that you are a member of the tribe if you can trace your lineage back to someone who is on. There's a couple of different like records that you can trace your lineage to. And if you can do that, you are Miamia, right? So it's not based on you have to have a certain percentage or be a certain generation removed, right? It is you are if you can do that. Right, which is also why we've seen such big booms in enrollment, right? Because a lot of times it can be hard to trace your lineage, but once one person in your family can, everybody can.
So they're all,
so
you're
then
all
it's
good.
like 50 people all at once. Right, well, because enrolled, because somebody in their family was finally able to track down the documentation that proves that they are a descendant. So,
and it sounds like there's folks, so there's genealogists, sounds like there's folks at the Myaamia Center that could help you with that if you were trying to sort of figure out your lineage.
Yes, both at the center and through the tribe itself. We have people who do that work.
Really neat. Okay, let's I appreciate the background and your attempts at some of the history and I know none of this was stuff that we talked about when I met you the first time.
Okay.
So I appreciate your willingness to go along with me on some of this stuff. Let's get back to kind of the work you're doing. So tell me more about what your role is in the Office of Assessment and some of the studies and work you're doing.
Yeah. So I came on in 2019 officially, right? So formally employed through the Myaamia Center in 2019 after I finished my doctorate in counseling psychology. You know, and for me, that was always something I wanted to do. I wanted to give back to the tribe. I wanted to be able to work for the tribe, help in some way. And so, you know, that was kind of the path that I was always headed, though I didn't know what form that would take. I came on, so there was a woman who was the director or the chair, I guess, at the time of our Nipwayone acquisition and assessment team is what it's called. Nipwayone is our word for knowledge. So, you know, that team looks at what is the impact of knowledge acquisition on the community. And so her name is Dr. Susan Mosley Howard. She basically chaired this team starting in 2012. She is also a counseling psychologist who has served various administrative roles at Miami University, but formed a relationship, honestly, since before I've even been engaged. So she, you know, pre-2005, she had started building this relationship with the tribe. And, you know, formally took on this position in 2012 as the chair of this team to look at what are some of those like psychological community health-based outcomes that are coming from reconnection with our knowledge system. And so then the team predominantly looked at 4 outcomes that were identified by tribal leadership at that time, right? So our tribal leadership sat down with this NOT team, which is what we call it for short, to identify what outcomes they're interested in, and identified 4. So academic attainment, well-being, connection and engagement, and national tribal growth and continuance. Right. So these are the 4 that our team that the NOT team specifically is rooted in. And that's what we're trying to understand. When I came in 2019, it became clear that the needs for assessment and evaluation at the Myaamia Center were far greater than just that. And so we basically reorganized, and now we have 3 teams in the Office of Assessment and Evaluation. So we have that team that does the NOT team still there. We have our program evaluation team, so specifically looking at like curricular outcomes from educational programming, or, you know, for example, we have various programs that are offered through the Myaamia Center, one of which being something called Indigenizing the Curriculum, which is a faculty learning community that is at Miami University, where faculty throughout the university can apply to be a part of this cohort, where they're studying really like Indigenous knowledge and how do we know who's credible and who's not, and Indigenous perspectives to incorporate into the classroom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Seeing higher education as a platform to be able to reach a lot of different people.
Mm-hmm.
And so then that hopefully over time will continue to trickle down, and all students at Miami will eventually start to learn about other ways of knowing, specifically Indigenous ways of knowing, but hopefully it just challenges the idea that these like Western, if you will, systems of knowledge are the first. Anyway, that's a big tangent. That's what indigenizing the curriculum is. Things like that have some sort of goal or outcome they're looking to achieve. Our program evaluation team will do evaluation on, are those objectives being met, right? So it's much more like goal oriented of that program. And then we also have a language assessment team. So looking at specifically the impact of language on our tribal community. And so, I'm really falsely piecing these apart as academicians do, right? We piece apart these things in ways that are actually really interconnected because we have to have a model to talk about it. But so we have these three teams, but really we work all together. Any given assessment often incorporates all three. Any research project we're doing, it will incorporate all three of these teams to put it together.
Yeah. And are you on all three of those teams?
As the director of the office, I have my fingers in all three, but we kind of have people who head up each. So I'm predominantly over the NOT team because of my psychological background. We contract through, we have a couple of people who work for the Discovery Center at Miami University, which is basically a center that helps with research and data analysis stuff. They do our program evaluation predominantly. And then we have a woman who is a second language specialist who heads up our language assessment team. But I do have my finger and my hands in all three of these areas, right? So that is something that I am a part of.
So let's talk about the NOT team and the work you're doing there. So what are some of the projects and outcomes you've had?
Yeah, so we collect data largely with 3 samples of the broader Myaamia community, right? So the first we see as, and we're doing mixed methods research, so both quantitative and qualitative. We do a lot of, with our broader just tribal community, right? So we go to community events and we're largely doing observational data collection to date. That will change. We have plans in the future of doing more quantitative stuff, but to date, we've done predominantly just observations and looking at, shifts over time at tribal events. We also have our summer programs that I've mentioned as having attended, but now today we have programs from cradle to grave. So we have a 0 to 5, a 6 to 9, a 10 to 16, a 17 and 18-year-old, and an 18 and older group. So we have all of these programs that we've expanded out to, and we do a mixed methods assessment of that every year. A pre-test, post-test comparison, right? So looking at how people change on various things as a result of participating in this.
And are these all programs delivered by the center?
By the tribe.
By the tribe, okay.
So these come from the Cultural Resources Office from the tribe.
I see.
And the Myaamia Center, again, we have a lot of power to be able to support the tribe in these initiatives.
Okay.
Right. So yeah, that comes from the Cultural Resources Office or the Cultural Resources Extension Office, which is the same office in Indiana, right? So we basically have this extension office that serves Myaamia Tribe of Oklahoma citizens in Indiana, which again gets complicated. But if you think of that Myaamia Tribe, Myaamia Nation of Indiana split, it makes more sense. This is Myaamia Tribe, but in Indiana. So that's our second group, is the summer programs. And then the third group are those heritage students at Miami University. And the reason that tends to be our most robust, highly controlled group, because we have a lot of more control over them, right? They're a part of this formal program that's, 9 months of the year they're there. And so we do, with them, I interview every single student as they're entering the program and again as they're leaving, whether that's at graduation or leaving for some other reason. And so I interview all of them. We give them, a quantitative series of scales that we're giving them, and we track them throughout there. And I do observational data collection throughout the 4 years that they're there. And yeah, so those are our 3 groups. Now we're looking at those 4 outcomes that I mentioned across all 3 of these groups. So if you can imagine, that's a lot, it becomes a lot of data really quickly, right? So we have small sample sizes, but we have a lot of data on those small groups. And it also becomes really tricky. I'm setting up another big part of my work right now. It becomes really tricky to manage all of that data. If you think about it, we're not there yet. But in the future, there will come a time where there's any given individual who has interacted with the tribe through formal programming from age 0 until they die. And we want to be able to know, what has been their trajectory throughout their life.
This was going to be my question.
How do you possibly do that? Right? How do I look at that? And so it historically took a lot of manpower. Again, 2012 was when we first started collecting data. And so we don't have a ton of longitudinal data yet, although a lot of people would argue we do in 2024, but to us, it's not a lot yet.
Yeah.
But we looked into all the available software for data storage, data filtering, data, all of that. And there was just really nothing that served our needs. And so the Myaamia Center is often at the forefront of building technology to support what we do. So that's happened with ILDA, which is, and I don't even remember what that stands for. That's awful. It's basically our database that houses all of the documentary record and makes it searchable for community members as well as for linguists who are working on the language itself. But for our team, right, we needed something that I could import data, assign participant numbers, filter based on different things. And then, in theory, I could look at a single person and everything we have on them throughout their lifespan. Or maybe a cohort of individuals, like a cohort that went to camp at the same time, or a cohort that went to the heritage program at the same time. Yeah. It can filter on different things. It exports the data to be uploaded into software to analyze statistically, right? Or in whatever way. So we built it, right? So it started out as The
second secret word is lacrosse, LACROSSE.
It started out as a capstone project through the computer science and software engineering department at Miami, right? And so this is one of the awesome benefits of being housed at a university, is that they have all these students that need projects and we have all these projects that need done. And so often they can take those over. So I led a capstone team in conjunction with someone named Doug Troy, who is a professor emeritus in that department, who now works for the Myaamia Center. But we led a team to build this database, basically. Well, then, our needs became far greater than what undergraduate students were really able to do in, a semester where they're limited, time limited. And so we had graduate students who took over these positions.
Nice.
And they, basically we're in the process right now. They tore down the entire database and rebuilt it because it wasn't what they wanted it to be. Which I think is a normal part of software development from what I've been told.
Yeah.
And so, I now have this database that allows me to track individual data and different types of data, right? So we have Excel spreadsheets, we have Google documents or Word documents that we're uploading. We have images, we have audio files, we have all sorts of stuff. And I can look at a single person, I can look at cohorts, I can look at whatever variable, a specific program, a specific year, whatever, and pull everything. And so, it's pretty incredible. Long term, we have the hopes of, and I don't know what form this will take, but long term, we hope to have a partnership with some sort of software that is like a data collection software, something like Qualtrics, which is predominantly what we use, that can then speak to our database so that we don't have to do the manual entry, right? Because as anybody who works in research knows that the cleaning of data sources takes up a lot of time, but also creates some error, introduces error into data collection, right? So we hope to eventually have it so that Qualtrics or something similar reads directly into our database. We've also worked with, at Miami University, the Center for Analytics and Data Science, who created some data visualization software for us. So they did one small project that allows us, again, because we have small sample sizes, we often don't have enough power to be able to detect significant differences statistically, but we want to visualize the data because it tells us a really important story. And so they created basically the software that pulls from certain files and automatically populates graphs for us.
Well,
And again, that's just a very small piece of our data. It's just heritage students on this one scale. But, in theory, we could build that out for everything. So my long-term goal is to have this Qualtrics, automatically speaks to our database, which automatically speaks to this data visualization. So from the second somebody takes a survey, it's being updated in this data visualization. So like a real-time changes in our data. I'm told this is very ambitious.
Well, I imagine with all these crazy stuff with AI now too, that there'll probably be some really sharp things down the road that you can't even think of right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so anyway, so that's kind of a little bit of a pet project that we're working on. I will. Oh, go ahead.
Thinking about some of these big outcomes you're measuring, like academic attainment, I think and like tribal growth, those are things I think that are easy to sort of conceptualize. The tribe gets bigger, the grades get better. What kinds of things are you looking at for like wellness and then tribal connectedness and engagement? Like what do those outcomes look like?
I'll start with the connection and engagement because I think I can address that fairly quickly. The well-being one is much harder, I think, to address. So we use a scale that was developed by a researcher named Snowshoe in 2015, they're a First Nations member in Canada. And they created what's called the Connectedness scale. And we took that, we adapted it for the Myaamia community because there was a lot of language in it that our community just doesn't use, but we adapted it. We normed it within our community, did a pilot test, did a whole test with the tribal community and psychometrically validated it, the whole thing. Yeah. And so we use that predominantly for our connection and engagement piece. But then we also do the qualitative observations as well. And any interviews we do, we're asking about engagement and connection as well. But, thinking about largely, I think about when we have tribal events, what questions are people asking, right? So I vividly remember a year, and I can only go, for like cultural reasons, can only go into so much depth on this, but like a year where people were suddenly asking questions about death practices, for example, right? And like historically and today, what do we do around death? And it's like, why is this why is this coming up now, right? Like, why are people engaged in this way? So like our observations allow us to then go talk to people and see like what makes you interested in this now, and start to do more of that, more qualitative relational piece of research, which, some Western researchers would say is not robust enough, but from an Indigenous perspective, it very much is.
Yeah.
And is very important. So anyway, that's the connectedness and engagement piece. So we have this quantitative scale that we're giving at most. So our heritage students get it. Everybody a certain age and older gets it for the summer programs. It's too advanced for our younger kiddos, but older kiddos and the adult programs, they get it every year. And then we're doing the observational data collection as well for the connection and engagement. Well-being is a tricky one. Right. It always felt really slippery for us for a couple of reasons, right? Any of the research that we were doing on wellness models for Indigenous communities were largely rooted in a deficit perspective, right? So looking at what are the problems? What are the diabetes rates? What are the alcoholism rates? What are the suicide rates? And how do we overcome that? Which is an incredibly valid question, right? It's an important question to be asking, but for our community has never worked, right? Like anything that comes from it feels very temporary, feels reactive, feels driven largely by professionals and individuals rather than the community. And then the other issue is that these models also treat all Indigenous people the same. And we know that every nation has a different perspective on what wellness even means, right? Like, what does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to live your life well? That's culturally grounded. And with every community having a different perspective on this, I think that, again, I'm biased, but I think that means that we need to have our own models of what that looks like. And so, we've pulled some like identity models. We've done some various things that are like indicators of well-being, but have never had like a really good well-being model until recently. So we obtained some funding through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to basically create our own well-being model. And we started that. We're in June of 2025, we'll be wrapping up this 3-year grant. So I guess that means we started in 2022. Timelines in the COVID world are just hard to keep track of. But so we started this project. We started it before we even obtained the funding, right? So Daryl and I sat down at the start of COVID, so in 2020, and started meeting weekly to just discuss what would well-being look like from a Myaamia perspective. You know, pulling from those documentary records, from those Jesuit and French missionaries and their observations, pulling from the language sources, pulling from interviews with elders, like these archived interviews we have with elders before they passed away, right? So a whole lot of sources that we were pulling from, as well as just our own experiences and observations, and put together this preliminary model, like what does well-being look like for Myaamia people. But we recognized at that stage that this was still like the Haley and Darrow model. And we didn't want it to be just the Haley and Darrow model. So once we got that funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we started doing focus groups with tribal members across our population hubs in the tribal community. And these focus groups asking people those same questions we were asking ourselves to see what supports what we're already suggesting, but also what is challenging it, what needs to be added. And so we kind of came to this finalized model of wellness, and then have since been engaging in a process of creating a quantitative measurement tool to help us be able to measure wellness from a Myaamia perspective. And so we're in the process of our data analysis right now in the modeling, and it's holding up really well. We had some stats consultants who were like, I've never seen something hold up this well, something this big hold up this well. So we're really happy and excited with that. But generally, you know, this model for us suggests that there are 3 domains that contribute to wellness, right? The first is knowledge. So again, in order to live your life properly, which I guess I should back up a moment. This entire model is called Nahimetosenoinge in our language, which is translated to living well, but literally means to live a proper human life, right? So that's the way we think of like health and wellness. Right? So like, what does it mean to live a proper human life? And in order to do that, you have to have a certain amount of knowledge. And, you know, we have these 5 knowledge domains that we generated, right? Things like ecological knowledge, things like, you know, your government or civic knowledge, things like that. The second domain is values, right? So what does it mean to be a good Myaamia community member, right? Like, the way I describe values, both within the community, but also like with clients that I'm seeing in my private practice, it's like when everything else is stripped away, what guides your behavior? What tells you what's important? And so, you know, for us, this is going to be things like caring for one another, right? So like showing care. And there's a whole metaphor that goes along with this. You know, that would take a lot of time to explain, but
Yeah.
You know, caring for each other. This is things like, so one of them is Nipohkayangwe, which is we are conscious, we are wise, we are aware. And the reason I like to use that one as an example is because we have a lot of language that we use around that one. So it suggests that we need to be aware of what's going on around us, try to understand and be curious about the world and about why things happen the way they do. And that's largely why we hold so much value on elders, because they've had so much more life experience, that they have more awareness and they have more knowledge, right? To be able to understand the world most of the time, not always. You know, when we part from one another in our interactions, we'll say Nipwakalo, which is the command form of this, right? So like literally as we leave each other, we're like, be conscious, be aware, be wise, right? Like that's what we're telling each other when we, you know, part ways. Granted, that's like a temporary parting of ways, not like if I were parting for months, I wouldn't say that. I would say something different. But so yeah, that's an example of one of our values. And we have this formalized 8 values that we've identified. And then the last is something that we call intentional interactions. And this is, the way I like to describe it is that every being, every human has a soul. And that soul or that being interacts with the world around us, right? And we have to do so intentionally in order to live that proper human life, right? And when we are doing it carelessly, recklessly, unintentionally, is when we invite in vulnerability and, you know, we're not living properly. And so there are, you know, these 5 domains: the physical body, the spiritual world, our social environment, our mental, thought, emotional, right? So all of these things we have to interact with intentionally.
Amazing.
And so, this is all, we have examples for all of these rooted in historical records as well as contemporary examples, right? So it is a pretty robust model now. We're still building it out. It's still going to take a long time. But, I like to say in this instance is you can tell then, like, if that's how we view well-being, can you imagine how these like traditional like World Health Organization well-being measures just don't work? If that's your perspective on what it means to live well, then these measures aren't going to work for you.
Yeah.
That being said, we also recognize that our tribal community, people are not just Miamia, right? Like they're coming with other identities as well.
Sure.
So I'm not saying that those other measures aren't useful at all, because they are. But if we're trying to piece out just that Miamia part, which is what we're often doing when we're looking at a pre-test, post-test assessment of the impact of an educational program, we need to know that. Like, that's the piece we need to know, is how is your well-being as a Miamia person being impacted? And so that's why this is really important for us to be doing. So that's another massive project over the last 3 years that we've been engaging in and are about to wrap up.
So with all this really cool data and really neat things you're measuring, has the Myaamia Tribe now taken that data and made sort of impactful program changes that have sort of improved things and so on? And a little bit of that? Yeah.
Honestly, that's probably one of my favorite parts of my work. Because, I was trained formally in a counseling psychology program. So I know the academic setting where you do this research that's really cool, but then your last step is just like, all right, here are my suggestions, but you do it.
Yeah.
Right? Like you figure it out, and then we can do something in the future, right? It's not grounded in community or practice, right? Like there's often this disconnect between clinical and academic or research people, right? But we very much operate within and predominantly for our community. And so the community is engaged in every step of the process, right? And so when we're creating some sort of assessment or evaluation, we're sitting down with whoever is the head of that program, asking, what are your goals? What do you want people to get? What do you want to know about this? So that informs what we're even assessing. And then our team is able to craft this assessment, administer it, whether it's a survey or an evaluation or whatever. We administer it. We analyze the data, we generate these recommendations, but then we sit down and have a meeting where we're just having a conversation about what changes could come from this, right? So we're saying, here are the data and here's what the data are supporting, but what's practical for you as the educator in this instance? So we give recommendations, but then we work together to create what the change might be. And so, I'm trying to think of an example of a change that's come from this. I mean, there have been several, but I think so Miamia people tend to be and Indigenous people largely tend to be very implicit in the way that we teach certain things, right? So we're not explicitly outlining and talking about values, for example. I'm not saying, here are the 8 community values and here's how, right? Like, that's just not how it goes. But then that also can lead to, at least at this point that we're at, in our revitalization process, people just miss that, and it maybe doesn't get incorporated into educational programming in an intentional way. And so through our assessments, we came to find out that people had no idea what some of these values were, right? Or they didn't have the language to talk about it. And so we were able to give some suggestions of how to more explicitly incorporate this. And so, for example, at our summer programs, our youth play a lacrosse game against the Seneca Cayuga Nate tribe. So it's like our youth camp against their youth camp, because it's the same week of the summer. So now the person from the Myaamia community who, I don't want to say coaches, but like he's the head of the program, he often is doing a lot of the lacrosse teaching. He is more explicit. Again, he's not saying it's this value and this is how we do it, but he's giving this like speech, like a hype up speech, right? Like in sports, that incorporates values into it. And so then students start to think about, like, this is something that's important to us. And this is how we engage both within our community, but with other communities. Our younger, well, not the youngest, but the younger kids, a 6 to 9 year old group, they do a morning huddle every morning and they talk about, okay, how do we treat one another? So they are a little bit more explicit at that age, right? But these values get incorporated in a little bit more explicit of a way because it was just getting missed before. So that's an example.
Really cool. You folks can't be the only folks doing this. Is this kind of work happening? Have you seen this kind of work happening in other tribes? And have you sort of, shared, some of the ways you're doing things or learned kind of methods and ideas from them? Or is this something that, that is pretty much you folks doing?
That's a really good question. And I am not going to be presumptive enough to say that we are the only ones. Like, I would never claim that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do I sensitively address this question? I think a lot of tribes buy into a lot of these more Western models, right? And like, if they are doing research, it's a lot of times diabetes rates. It's a lot of time, right? Like, it's a lot of these outcomes that we've always had issue with, right? So this like strengths-based, community-specific perspective is a little bit more recent, I should say. That doesn't mean that we're the only ones. There, in fact, I just came back in October from the Algonquian conference, which is predominantly a linguistics conference, but several of us got connected through Doug Whalen out of Yale, put together a whole like subgroup on the impact of language on well-being. And so there were several of us who do that work at that conference and presenting our research. And so there are these individual efforts. And so I got to see Melissa Lewis, who is doing work out of Cherokee Nation, and Maria Crouch doing work with Alaska Natives.
Yes.
Right. And so, I mean, not Algonquian speaking languages, but like they're doing the same type of work just within their own communities.
Yeah.
And so I do see that as being a future direction, right? Like that is a very good thing that Western models do, is like, I don't want you to reinvent the wheel if something already exists.
Yes.
So like, if there's a process we are doing or that Maria's doing or Melissa or anybody else, like, let's make that easier for other tribes to access. So I see that as being a potential future direction. That, getting together with other communities to put together some sort of model for how to do this work is really helpful.
Well, this database you're creating could be something you share down the road, in some form that they, at least the technical aspects of it, obviously the data itself. But,
and, we do the third year of our grant, which is what we're in right now. Our process is creating we initially called it a manual, but, I don't love the implications of that word. It's very prescriptive. So we're calling it a workbook. This workbook that we're writing one for a more academic audience and then tailoring one for a community or like tribal audience. But it's basically sharing what our process was so that people can learn like the steps of how to create such a model and a measurement tool. And one of the outlets that we intend to use to share this is with the National Breath of Life program, which I haven't even mentioned.
Yeah, what's that?
So Daryl Baldwin is, I believe, the co-director or co-chair. I don't remember the exact terminology there, but he works alongside one other person in the National Breath of Life program, which is connecting people or tribal nations to resources to build their language from documentary record, right? So this process that we went through in the 90s, now other communities are needing to do for various reasons, right? Whether they had the same issues as us, or in some cases, they're a little bit, let's say, a little bit delayed in terms of like their last speakers are passing away now. And so they're trying to do that work to build up their documentary record so that they can access it for the future, right? So looking forward to future generations, which that's a whole Indigenous perspective as well. So basically, Daryl and Gabriella, who is now out of Oregon, they work together on this program that helps these communities to build their documentary record. They all use ILDA. And then how do you take that and incorporate within community programming? And so we see this as easily just like becoming infused in that program of like, okay, you're doing this work. Let's think about how you're going to assess it, right? Like, let's build this into at least your thought process, if not developing the the tools to be able to do this in the future. So that's one route we hope to take. Though I recognize other communities who maybe have more robust, have held on to their language and culture, they also might have needs for this too. It'll just look a little bit different. So that's one route that we plan to take. But this workbook is intended to then be infused into trainings or the National Breath of Life program or whatever it might be. So that was one of our hopes. We didn't want it to just live within our community, even though I also don't want somebody to just like take our survey and plop it into their community, because that's not helpful, right? They don't have our knowledge system.
Yeah.
But you can do something similar.
Yeah, cool. Tell me a little bit about your private practice. So are you working primarily with folks from the tribe?
No, unfortunately, the ethics code in psychology basically prevents you from being able to work with people you know. And I would say most tribal members I know or know their family members well enough that I ethically really shouldn't see them. That's something I'm trying to navigate how to go about doing. Yeah. But also, I'm only licensed in the state of Ohio currently. And so they would have to be residents and living in Ohio in order for me to be able to see them, which offers additional challenges. Now, that being said, I am currently in the process of applying for PsycTests, which is basically a compact across states. It predates COVID, though it really blew up during COVID if you're a PsycTests provider and somebody lives in a PsycTests state, you can see them via telehealth, even though I'm not licensed in that state, for example. And so I think that will open up my ability to see more people. I'm hopeful that means that, because I'm a member of the Society of Indian Psychologists, I'm hopeful that my connections there will enable me to serve then Indigenous populations throughout the United States. But currently, no, that is something that's lacking in my practice. So I predominantly just see people in the local Cincinnati area where I lived before and Cleveland where I live now. And
do you know if there are Indigenous psychologists that serve Myaamia?
Oh, that serve specifically Myaamia? I actually don't.
Or the Myaamia folks have access to, or, it just makes me think about the interview I did with Dr. Bays, where he talked a lot of his Sweetgrass method that he talks about, and he talked just about the distrust that, Indigenous communities tend to have with sort of Western, therapies and sort of deliverers of services, and you see this, it's not just an Indigenous sort of issue, you see this culturally across the world, that folks often would rather have supports from folks that are at least connected to their culture in some way. And knowing that with SIP there's only 200 or 300 members of SIP that are I think there's twice that, but half the members are students, which is great. So it shows that there's going to be, hopefully a lot more folks out there doing the work. Future. But it seems wild that I understand ethically, giving therapy to your cousins is probably sketchy, but, it also just seems like it's a barrier too.
It is.
These folks aren't able to access.
And I do think that there's a piece of navigating that ethical landscape that comes with time and experience. And you have to keep in mind, I am recently licensed. I've been licensed since, it was either 2019 or 2020 when I became licensed. Oh, okay. And I didn't actually start practicing until just over a year ago.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
And so I'm still early. I'm still new. There is in our community a medical student who is engaged with our work at the Myaamia Center, the health and wellness work that I've been talking about. And I know that he is incredibly interested in creating opportunities for Myaamia people specifically, right? And so what form this takes, I don't know, but I do know this is something that's budding that could come up in the future, right? I know one of his long-term goals is to create a clinic that serves primarily Myaamia people or other Indigenous people in the Northern Indiana, because he's from Northern Indiana, in the Northern Indiana region. And I could see something where, I'm supervising clinicians who work in that space. I probably would not want to work there, but I could supervise and provide trainings that make their work more effective for Myaamia people, for example. So that would be a very long-term goal, but I see that as being something that's possible.
Yeah.
Right now, I don't actually know what type of access Myaamia people have. That's actually a really good question that I haven't asked.
Mm.
You know, I just think about like a lot of my family members access healthcare through the Indian Health Service.
Mm-hmm.
The Pokagon tribe has a health clinic up in Michigan. My dad will travel 2 hours to go there for healthcare, right? And so, because my parents are in northern Indiana, and so I imagine something like that is predominantly how, or through their health insurance, they'll seek out a general practitioner. But again, like you said, how effective that is if they don't have much knowledge about Indigenous communities or about Myaamia people specifically, who knows?
Well, the question I wanted to ask, which I obviously can't answer, is sort of, and maybe something to ask down the road, is would you have seen, if you were serving people from the tribe, would you have seen sort of, changes in them in your private practice as a result of some of these cultural programs that the tribe's putting out and that sort of thing? It's interesting to know.
It would be very interesting
in terms of their own mental health and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. I will say that my work, so even though I don't serve Myaamia people, that my research through the Myaamia Center does positively impact my work as a clinician still, right? Like it makes me not assume any one perspective on well-being, and that becomes a conversation in my work, right? Like what does well-being even mean to you?
Yeah.
And I'm not going to make assumptions just because you're white or just because you're Asian American that you believe a certain way.
Sure.
Let's define that together and let's figure out how you can live the best life you can.
Yeah.
So I will say it has positively impacted my practice, even though I'm not seeing Myaamia people or Indigenous people specifically.
Yeah. Really awesome. Just to wrap it up, just kind of, you mentioned yet another job you have. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing with this fitness company. This sounds cool.
Yeah, I mean, that's totally just a for fun thing. I do a couple hours a week. I really enjoy it.
Yeah.
So the company's called Fitness Blender. It started out as a husband and wife team who create not mental health, like fitness content. So they just do videos that are like workout videos. They've really grown their team over time, and now they employ like other personal trainers. They have a lot of like, what is it called? DPTs, doctorates of physical therapy, who do like physical therapy content. Yep. And then they hired 2 mental health professionals to round it out with like more of the mental health, mental well-being side. The other one I think took on too much. And so she's taken a step back. So I'm the primary person in the mental health space. It started out writing a lot of content. So like writing articles that's basically connecting mental health and physical health, or mental health and fitness. But, the world doesn't love to read.
The third secret word is heritage.
So it has shifted quite a bit since I started. And it's been several years now, which is wild. I think it was 2020 or 2021 when I started. Yeah. And so I largely do guided meditations now. So I'm creating videos for their platform that are, some just like really cool guided practices. So, currently I'm working on a gratitude body scan, right? So like combining gratitude practice as well as the body scan, right? Like the mindfulness body scan. I try to be creative and just see what people like. I think some people thrive and some people hate that space where what people like drives what you do. But like, if it's helpful for people, I see it as being a very positive thing. So the content that gets the most interaction is largely any content around sleep. So I do a lot of like sleep meditations, anything around, trying to think. A lot of like, I have some eating related things gets quite a bit of interaction, but then like anything that involves like movement. So I've got some like mindful movement type content that I have created. I had one that was like a guided visualization for like before a workout to enhance your workout, right? So visualizing yourself doing the movements you're going to do in your workout to hopefully enhance, right? We know athletes do this all the time. To enhance their performance in a game. So basically taking that idea to a workout. I created one that just got released. That was I forget what I called it, but it was taking the idea of HIIT training, right? So like high intensity interval training where you're doing like really intense and then you take time off. and applied that to meditation, right? Like, let's
Wow.
focus intensely for 30 seconds and then let's take a 30-second break and just like move between. Because in my mind, like, that's what we do in daily life, right? It's rare. You know, right now I've been focusing for an hour and a half, like, but that's more rare. Like, it's typically
Yeah.
I focus really intensely for a couple minutes and then my attention wanders and then I have to
Yes.
redirect. And especially for folks, you know, with attention difficulties, whether it's processing difficulties or ADHD or whatever, this helps, I think, to strengthen your ability to move in and out of that focused space and your ability to notice, like, oh, I'm not focusing. I need to redirect.
I want this. I mean, I had ADHD, and I used to do like those 1 minute meditation apps. There's a 1 minute timer, and what that was long.
1 minute's a long time.
You know, but it was tolerable. My mind didn't wander too much. You know, I've since gotten medication and whatnot that sort of helped with that. But before that, you know, a 30-second dose and a break would be perfect for someone like
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah.
Unfortunately, a lot of that lives behind a paywall. So, like,
Right.
you have to sign up
do
for.
they have any free offerings to sort of bring in at all, or do you know that?
Not for the mental health content. Well,
Okay.
there's some of my written content is free,
Gotcha.
but the guided meditations, that kind of stuff, primarily live behind the paywall. There is one that's free, and it is the one. It was incorporated in a like challenge they did that got released on YouTube. So they have YouTube, and then they have their own platform.
Okay, I'll look for it. Yeah,
So, yeah.
And they're called Fitness Blender.
Yes.
Nice.
Yep.
Really cool. Neat.
Yeah.
Haley, you're doing so many cool things. It's
I know. And it's all really random, but it keeps my days fun because I also believe I have undiagnosed ADHD. And so I've always been the type of person, I don't like to do one thing all day.
right.
I like to wear a lot of hats because then I get to just from thing to thing. And
Absolutely. That's awesome. Haley, it's been absolutely fascinating talking and learning from you. You're doing some really cool work, and
Thank you.
yeah, I look forward to following you some more. Yeah.
yeah, thank you for offering this space for me to talk about the work. I think, you know, that's really important to lift up different voices. So, Mishinewe, big thanks.
If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to check out these other episodes of the Behavior Speak podcast. Episode 111, The Sweetgrass Method, a culturally responsive approach among American Indian Alaska Native peoples, with Dr. Mark Standing Eagle Bays. Episode 150, Education is the New Buffalo, Healing and Wellness for the Piikani Blackfoot People, with Angela Greer. And episode 181, Indigenizing Higher Education, with Dr. Robin Zeptahola Minthor. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please follow us on Instagram @BehaviorSpeak.